when we start talking about the terminology involved in hard drives, it can get very confusing very fast. So we're going to try to tease out some of these terms as best we can. The first term we want to talk about are basic and dynamic drives. So a basic drive is one that is just a standalone drive like this. This is an old drive. This is an old PATA drive, very old. In fact, it's probably tiny, right? I don't even see the size on it offhand. But anyway, oh, here it is, 2 gigabytes. Not very big. Can you believe it used to be 2 gigabytes on a big thing like this? So with a basic disk, you can't span 2 drives. So by the way, here's one from a laptop. So if it's a dynamic disk, I could actually logically put these together and have a larger drive. But with a basic disk, I can't do that. So you cannot span these partitions across drives. Now each unit is called a partition, and if I go to my disk manager here, you'll see that I have 2 hard drives in my machine right now. Disk 0, these, by the way, everything over here on the left is the physical drive. Everything over on the right is the logical drive. So I've got 2 physical drives. The first physical drive has all one giant partition on it, and it's a basic type. So it says basic data partition. The disk 1 over here, I've got 3 partitions. One is called C. If I wanted to, I could call another one E or X or L or whatever I want to call it. I've got 2 partitions on here that I haven't given any letters to. These are used by Windows in the background for recovery and booting and so forth. So those are the partitions. And with a basic disk, we can have partitions, and these partitions can be of 2 different types. MBR, which is an older system, and GUID, which is the newer system. As a matter of fact, Windows 10 will not even load on an MBR disk. It must be GUID type. And there are several reasons for that. Larger disk sizes and the more tolerance for errors, and expanded things like file path names and so forth. So lots of new stuff with the GUID type. With a dynamic disk, you don't have partitions. I shouldn't actually say that, because you do. Actually, if I, in a dynamic drive, let's say I put these 2 drives together into a dynamic single dynamic drive, they are one partition. But I can separate that partition out just like I could with partitions over here and call them volumes. So when we speak of the word volume, we're talking about a dynamic disk. When we speak about partitions, we're talking about basic disk types. Since there are no partitions, we don't have partition types with dynamic. What we do have is simple, span, striped, mirrored, or RAID 5. Let's see if I can. I'm going to click on the physical drive here and click this convert to dynamic disk, and you'll see that here's where I can select what disks I want to convert, and here's what I was looking for. You can see that once it's converted to a dynamic disk, I've got span, striped, mirrored, and RAID 5. Now, if it's none of those, then it's just simple drive, which is just like the single drive, except you've turned it into a dynamic disk. You haven't actually spanned across 2 disks yet. We will talk about these more later on. Now, according to some sources, once the partitions are created on a basic disk, you can't change them. That's not quite true. You can shrink them and expand them using some other software. Volumes, though, you can expand and shrink as you need. Basic disks support multiple operating systems. So I could have an operating system, say, on a partition here, and an operating system on another partition here, if I cut this one in half, say. and have a dual boot computer. You can't do that with dynamic disks because you really only have one partition. All these volumes exist on one partition, and you would need more than one partition in order to do that. Each partition can have its own file system, FAT, NTFS, there's lots of others. REFS is a new one that's coming along in Windows, and there are several in the Linux world. So each partition can have its own file system, and each volume can have its own file system. Each partition can have its own drive letter or mount point, and each volume can have its own drive letter or mount point. Now when I say mount point, it's possible to name a drive and set it somewhere in the file structure. We're not going to get into that in this course, but you can certainly do it. I will show you where that's done, by the way. If I click change drive letter and path and just say change, you see I've got two options here. Assign the following drive letter or mount in the following empty NTFS folder. Now this is grayed out at this point for several reasons, but you can see that I have an option here for mounting it into the NTFS folder and giving it a name, and it looks just like a folder instead of like a drive. So that's what I mean when I say mounting a mount point. All right, next we're going to take on this MBR and GUID and talk about those two things in a little bit more detail.